He was a millionaire CEO. She was just his secretary. For 4 years, she worked in silence, carrying papers, booking flights, hiding her feelings behind polite smiles. And then, one Friday evening, he fired her. No warning, no explanation, just a letter. But what if that wasn't the end? What if that same woman discovered she was carrying his child alone, jobless, and still quietly in love with a man who left without looking back? How does a broken woman find the strength to rebuild when the world she trusted collapses? Can a man consumed by guilt, grief, and power ever learn how to love again, not as a boss, but as a father? And when life brings them back together, will the truth be enough? This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about second chances. It's about the soft, ordinary moments that make us whole again. Stay with us to discover how a termination letter became the beginning of a life worth living. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. Let's begin. After 4 loyal years, Eleanor Graves thought nothing could shake her steady world at Sullivan and North, until the man she quietly loved told her to pack her things. It was a gray Friday afternoon in late October, the kind of day where the sky sagged low with cloud and everything smelled faintly of salt and smoke from chimneys already waking for the season. The office, usually alive with the soft buzz of keyboards and the shuffle of design portfolios, felt oddly hushed. Ellie had stayed late, as she always did, answering emails others had already let go. Straightening the communal kitchen, refilling the printer, she found peace in the small rhythms, in being the quiet engine behind the day. When her office phone rang at 5:42 p.m., she expected it to be someone from accounting asking for the end-of-week brief. Instead, it was Marla from reception, her voice tight. "Mr. North would like to see you. Now." That alone wasn't strange. Ellie had met with Graham North hundreds of times over the years, but something in Marla's voice, perhaps the way she didn't soften it with a polite please, or the fact that she didn't say the CEO the way she usually did, made Ellie pause. Still, she smoothed her blouse, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and made her way down the quiet corridor toward the corner office. The hall felt longer than usual, the walls more sterile. The carpet, a tasteful slate blue, muffled her steps until they felt detached from her own body. She passed framed architectural sketches. Graham had handpicked himself sharp lines, impossible angles, everything clean and ordered. Inside the office, he didn't look up when she entered. He stood behind his desk, tall as ever, impeccably dressed in navy, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a white envelope. She waited for him to speak. He didn't. After a long moment, he walked toward her, stopping just short of arm's length, and extended the envelope. That's all she asked quietly, the words escaping before she could trap them. Still, he didn't meet her eyes. His jaw tightened slightly. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "I'm restructuring. Your position is no longer necessary." Ellie took the envelope, her fingers trembling just enough for her to notice. She didn't open it. She nodded once, out of habit more than agreement. She told herself not to cry, not in front of him, not when everything inside her screamed that this wasn't about restructuring or headcount or company margins. Because a man didn't look away like that, not unless he was hiding something. She had loved working here, loved the rhythm of it, the way the building caught the afternoon sun through its ocean-facing windows. Loved the quiet authority she had built, piece by piece, from a life that had once fallen apart. And she had loved him, silently, stubbornly, against her better judgment. The envelope weighed more than it should have. "I see," she whispered. "I'll pack up." Still, he didn't look up. She thought, for a split second, he might speak, that he might offer something, an apology, an explanation, even just a thank you. But he remained still, a figure cut from stone. Ellie turned, her shoes clicking softly as she walked out of the office that had once been hers. In a sense, not by title or contract, but by the quiet consistency she had poured into its every crevice. Back at her desk, she packed slowly, carefully, not because there was much to take, just a few pens, a plant she never watered enough, a coffee mug that said, "Mondays need mercy," but because leaving quickly felt like giving up, and she hadn't given up on anything in a long time. Outside, the light was fading fast. The lobby was nearly empty. She nodded at the night security guard, who didn't ask questions. They never did. By the time she reached the parking lot, the wind had picked up, scattering dry maple leaves across the asphalt. One got caught in the crease of her coat and clung there as she walked to her car. Once inside, she sat still for a moment. The door shut. The world muted. She set the envelope on the passenger seat. 4 years. 4 years of arriving early, staying late, anticipating his moods, learning his silences. 4 years of watching him mourn in quiet flashes how he never mentioned his late wife, how his eyes always lingered too long on family portraits and client proposals, how he kept people at bay, including her, until Asheville, until the snowstorm, until the one night where he'd let the walls fall. Her breath caught in her throat. She picked up the envelope, ran her thumb under the seal, and tore it open not with curiosity, but with defiance. The letter was short, professionally phrased, no details, no appreciation, just dates, logistics, formality, like she had been nothing but a paperclip in the wrong drawer. Ellie folded the letter again, slower this time. Then, without ceremony, she ripped it in half, then into quarters. The pieces fluttered onto the passenger seat like broken promises. Tears welled up, unexpected, unwelcome. She wiped them away, frustrated with herself. It wasn't about the job. It was never just about the job. She cried because she had believed he was different, that beneath the cool exterior and stoic posture, there was a man capable of connection, of kindness, of something real. And now, sitting in the half-light of the nearly empty lot, she realized that the man she had trusted most had erased her in a single sentence. Ellie never looked back that night, not at the building, not at him, but the story was far from over. It was never supposed to happen. But that snowy night in Asheville rewrote the story between them. It had been 6 months before she was let go, though the memory now felt etched in a different life, a different version of herself. Eleanor Graves had been coordinating the company's spring client retreat in Asheville, North Carolina, a weekend conference for investors and architecture partners tucked away in a sleepy mountainside town framed by pine trees and early spring frost. The retreat was routine. She had handled every detail with the same meticulous touch she applied to all things schedules, catering, transport. She booked separate rooms, as always, made sure to leave Graham's itinerary uncluttered. She knew his habits, the way he skipped small talk, how he preferred plain coffee, no sugar, the way his eyes grew distant when conversations turned too personal. She never asked why. She simply learned to stay in the quiet, but no one expected the storm. It rolled in fast that Saturday evening. Clouds bruised the sky, wind howled down the mountain, and by the time the evening session wrapped, the main road was closed and their return shuttle canceled. The lodge manager offered a few rustic cabins along the ridge, no Wi-Fi, limited heat, but a roof. Everyone else had paired off or found other routes back to town. Only she and Graham were left, standing under a flickering porch light with overnight bags and snow in their hair. They were assigned a small one-room cabin at the edge of the tree line. Ellie remembered how awkward it had felt at first, the sound of snow hitting the tin roof, the single queen bed neatly made, the wood-burning stove already lit but low. She offered to sleep on the floor, and he shook his head without speaking, pointing to the couch instead. He lit the fire. She found a can of soup in the cupboard. It was supposed to be one of those nights you forget, but it wasn't. They ate in silence. Tomato soup, too salty. Graham found an old radio with a cracked speaker, static mostly, but it caught the end of a Johnny Cash song before fading into silence. He sat on the edge of the bed, still in his white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled just past his elbows. She sat on the floor near the fire, arms around her knees, unsure if it was the cold or something else making her feel small. I wasn't always like this, he said after a long pause. Ellie looked up. His voice was hoarse, like it had been unused for years. My wife. She was softer than me. Smarter, too. I thought working harder would build us something stable. I didn't notice how far she drifted until she was gone. He didn't say how she died. He didn't say her name. Just let the silence close back in. Ellie didn't respond, not because she didn't care, but because she did. She'd been trained to stay quiet when it mattered. People say more when you don't interrupt. Later, she handed him a blanket for the couch, but he didn't take it. Instead, he sat beside her near the fire, close enough for her to smell the cedar smoke on his collar, close enough for the silence to press against her ribs. Neither of them reached for the other, but when he finally leaned in, it was slow, uncertain. His lips brushed her cheek first, then the corner of her mouth. She didn't pull away. The kiss was quiet, careful, like something unwrapped too quickly might break. There were no promises, no confessions, just one long moment where grief and warmth and exhaustion tangled into something that resembled comfort. They undressed like people folding away grief not with hunger, but with need, the need to be touched, the need to be seen. The bed creaked, the fire popped, the world outside turned white with snow. And for that one night, Ellie let herself believe that two broken people might fit together, if only for a moment. She remembered the way he had traced her collarbone with his fingertips, almost reverently, how he had kissed the inside of her wrist, then rested her hand against his chest like it was something sacred. There was no talking afterward, just the steady rhythm of breathing in the dark, his back to her, her hand resting where his shoulder met his neck, warm, solid. By morning, the fire had gone out. So had he. She woke alone in the bed, sunlight pushing weakly through the frost on the windows. His bag was gone. The soup can had been thrown out. His scent lingered faintly in the pillow beside hers. There was a note, short, written on hotel stationery in precise handwriting. Thank you for the company. I'll see you back at the office. No explanation, no apology, just distance, repackaged. Ellie stood in that cold cabin for a long while before she moved. She made the bed, folded the blanket he didn't use, brushed her teeth. She told herself it hadn't meant anything. Told herself this was just what men like Graham North did retreat when things got too human. Back in Portland, he never mentioned it, not even a glance to acknowledge it had happened. Their working relationship resumed as if that night had been cut from time. But for Ellie, something had shifted. She had handed him a piece of herself, quietly, without demand, and he'd handed it back. From that morning on, Eleanor Graves began measuring silence in miles instead of minutes. She hadn't touched wine in weeks, not because she was trying, but because something inside her already knew. It had started subtly, a wave of nausea when the scent of cinnamon drifted from the cafe down the street, a sudden aversion to her favorite morning coffee, the rich, dark roast turning her stomach instead of waking it. At first, she'd blamed stress losing her job, the cold distance of Graham's silence, the invisible weight of what had been left unsaid. But then came the fatigue, bone deep, as if every cell in her body was holding something it couldn't name. Ellie didn't panic, not at first. She told herself it was nothing, that her body was catching up to the emotional exhaustion of the last few months. She'd sleep more, eat better, take long walks by the shore. Still, a voice inside her wouldn't settle. One morning, as the wind whipped against her apartment windows and her stomach turned before breakfast, she bundled herself into a coat and walked 3 blocks to the small corner pharmacy. It was the kind of place where time moved slower. Wooden floors, handwritten sale signs, a bell that jingled when you entered. The aisles were narrow, lined with cough drops and calendars with puppies on the covers. She didn't ask for help, just wandered slowly until she reached the shelf near the back between feminine hygiene and vitamins. Her fingers hovered over the different brands, heart pounding. She chose the simplest one, no digital screen, just a test with lines. She paid in cash and left quickly. The bag clutched tightly in her hand like it might betray her secret. Back in her apartment, the test sat unopened on the edge of the sink. She brushed her teeth first, tied her hair back, straightened the small towel on the hook, as if tidiness could prepare her for what was coming. The test was over in seconds, but waiting for the result felt eternal. She didn't pace, didn't fidget, just stared at the wall above the bathroom mirror, the ticking of the kitchen clock seeping through the silence like a slow, deliberate drum beat. Then she looked down. 2 lines, clear, definite, unmistakable. Ellie didn't cry. Not at first. She sat on the cool edge of the bathtub and let the moment settle into her like snow, soft, cold, unavoidable. A child? She was going to have a child. Her hand instinctively touched her stomach, flat and silent under her sweater. She closed her eyes. The image that came wasn't of cribs or lullabies or booties. It was of a man standing across a polished office, handing her a white envelope without meeting her gaze. Graham North. Of course it was his. There had been no one else. No dates, no flings. Only that one night in the cabin when something fragile had bloomed between them and wilted just as quickly the next morning. She stood up, suddenly needing air. The apartment felt too small, too quiet. She opened the window and breathed in the sharp Maine breeze, tinged with sea salt and chimney smoke. Below, the streets moved on cars passing, dogs barking, life continuing without pause. Inside, hers had changed forever. She walked to the kitchen drawer, the one she kept closed more than opened. It held old receipts, loose batteries, and a slim black envelope where she kept her savings, small bills. Carefully folded, she counted slowly, deliberately, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't much, enough for rent for a couple months, if she stretched it, maybe groceries. But doctor appointments, baby clothes, a crib. She closed the envelope and set it back. Her chest tightened, not with panic, exactly, but with something heavier. Something that whispered, "You're doing this alone." Her fingers found her phone without thinking. She stared at the screen, her contacts list still short, simple. There it was, his number, still saved under Graham Work, like she couldn't bear to change it even after being fired. She hesitated, then tapped to call. The ringing began, once, twice. Her breath hitched. What would she even say? "Hi. Remember me? The woman you slept with and fired in the same year I'm carrying your child?" The thought made her stomach twist more than the nausea. Ring, ring, click. Just before the voicemail kicked in, Ellie hit end and tossed the phone face down onto the couch. She couldn't do it. Not like this. Not when her voice still trembled and her heart still ached. Not when she wasn't sure if he'd answer with warmth or cold calculation. She walked back to the bathroom, picked up the test, and stared at it again, as if the lines might fade. But they didn't. They stayed, like truth, like permanence. She placed the test in a small box and slid it into the drawer of her nightstand. Then she sat on the bed, the afternoon light spilling in across the worn wooden floor, and wrapped her arms around her knees. Outside, seagulls cried overhead. The world felt impossibly large. Inside, her life had narrowed to a single point. She let the tears come, then, not loud, not desperate, just soft, steady streams that carried both fear and something else, something like awe. A life was growing inside her, a second heartbeat, a new beginning, wrapped in the most uncertain of circumstances. She whispered to the quiet room, "Well then, it's just us now, kiddo." And for the first time in days, her voice didn't shake. She started measuring time in doctor appointments and breakfast cravings. Gone were the days of team meetings, conference calls, and catered lunches at Sullivan and North. Her world had become smaller, quieter, but no less demanding. Each morning began with a wave of nausea, followed by a whispered pep talk in the mirror and a slow walk down to the harbor. The The cafe was tucked beside a bait shop, facing the docks where fishing boats rocked gently in the salty breeze. It wasn't glamorous. The floors creaked, and the espresso machine coughed more than it steamed. But it had a warmth partly from the cinnamon rolls that baked each morning, partly from the owner, Miriam, a kind woman with graying curls and hands that always smelled of flour. Ellie worked 3 shifts a week, mostly mornings. She poured coffee, wiped tables, and smiled at strangers who never asked too many questions. Her bump hadn't shown much yet, just a subtle softening under her apron. She didn't explain. No one pried. The work was tiring, but there was comfort in its rhythm, the hiss of the milk frother, the clink of ceramic mugs, the soft bell above the door. It gave her something to hold on to when everything else still felt uncertain. At night, after showering off the scent of pastries and coffee grounds, she sat by her window with a blanket draped over her shoulders and wrote in a small, sea-green journal, "Dear little sea star. Today I spilled orange juice on myself twice. Your fault. Probably. I'm not mad." It became a ritual writing letters to the tiny life inside her. She didn't know the baby's gender yet, didn't really care. Little Sea Star felt safer than son or daughter. It was tender, but distant enough to protect her heart from dreams she was still afraid to name. Sometimes, she'd write about her fears about money, about loneliness, about whether she was enough. Other times, she'd describe the way the sky looked over the harbor, or how a customer had made her laugh. She wanted the baby to know that even on hard days, beauty still slipped through the cracks. One afternoon, as she cleared a table near the window, she noticed an older man who had become something of a regular. He always sat at the same table, the one facing the sea, and ordered black coffee with no sugar. His coat was worn, his beard neatly trimmed. He read the newspaper slowly, always finishing the crossword in pen. But what Ellie noticed most was his tipping habit. He never left cash. Instead, every shift he came, he left behind a single coin, sometimes an old silver dollar, sometimes a faded buffalo nickel, always cleaned, always placed neatly beneath the mug. At first, she thought it was odd. Then it became endearing. She kept them in a small tin behind the counter, unsure if they were meant for her or simply a ritual of his. She never asked. She just smiled when he nodded on his way out. They were the small things that saved her. Because the big things fear uncertainty. The echo of Graham's absence still pressed heavy on her chest some nights. Then came the first ultrasound. She went alone. The waiting room was cool and quiet. Walls painted in soft pastels. Other women sat with partners or family. Ellie held her coat on her lap and rubbed her thumb across the folded corner of her appointment card. Inside the exam room, the technician was kind, chatty in a gentle way that didn't demand conversation. Ellie lay back, belly exposed, paper crinkling beneath her. The screen flickered to life. Then came the sound, fast, steady, unmistakably alive, a heartbeat. She didn't expect to cry, but the tears came anyway, quiet, unannounced, slipping into her hairline as she stared at the pulsing shape on the monitor. "There's your little one," the technician whispered. "Perfect little heartbeat." Ellie nodded, unable to speak, because for weeks her world had been silent, decisions made alone. Meals eaten in solitude, words kept folded inside. But this was sound, proof, a rhythm that belonged to someone she hadn't met, but already loved. She walked home slowly that day, one hand on her belly. The air smelled of salt and fallen leaves. She stopped at a market to buy apples and cinnamon, something warm for later, something that felt like home. That evening, she wrote again, "Dear little sea star, today I heard your heart. It's the most beautiful sound I've ever known." And just like that, her world had a sound again. She hadn't seen him in 5 months. But the moment he walked into the cafe, it was as if the floor tilted. Saturday mornings in Boothbay Harbor were usually gentle. Ellie had come to rely on the quiet hum of routine early sunlight spilling through the windows, the smell of nutmeg muffins rising from the oven, the regulars drifting in one by one. Her hands moved automatically behind the counter now, stirring cream into coffee, slicing banana bread, wiping counters already clean. She had begun to believe that life might go on like this, quiet, bearable, small enough to manage. Until Graham North walked through the door. He wasn't supposed to be there. That was the first thought that struck her, sharp and uninvited. The second was how different he looked. Not in the kind of way you notice across years, but in the way someone changes when they've stopped pretending. His suit was gone, replaced by a dark wool coat, the collar turned up against the morning chill. His face was leaner. The sharp lines beneath his eyes had deepened into shadows. He looked older, not in years, but in ache. He stepped into the cafe as if uncertain whether the air would hold him. His eyes scanned the room once, and then found her, and then stopped. For a long moment, neither moved. Ellie stood behind the counter, a rag still in her hand, her heart thudding loudly in her chest like the warning beat of a train approaching a bend. She told herself not to show anything, not anger, not warmth, not the 1,000 questions that surged through her bones. She didn't smile, she didn't scowl, she just nodded. He chose a table near the back table, 7 where the view overlooked the harbor. The same table the older man with the coin tips used to sit, though he hadn't been in all week. Ellie took it as a sign, though, of what she couldn't say. She poured a fresh cup of black coffee and walked it over. Her hand trembled slightly as she set it down. He said nothing, neither did she. Their eyes met briefly, his gaze searching, almost cautious. Hers was steadier, but only on the surface. She turned and walked back to the counter. For the next 20 minutes, he sat in silence. No newspaper, no phone, just his hands wrapped around the coffee mug, shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing against something heavier than the wind outside. Ellie tried not to watch him, failed. Each time she glanced up, she found him still staring out the window, eyes glassy with thought. He looked lost. And that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. When he stood to leave, he tucked a folded note beneath the mug. No coins, no dollar bills, just a scrap of paper. She waited until the doorbell chimed behind him, until the sound of his steps faded into the morning, and then walked to the table. She unfolded the note with fingers she hadn't realized were clenched. It read, in his unmistakably careful handwriting, "I shouldn't have let you go." No signature, just the silence of a man who'd said too little, too late. Ellie folded the note and slipped it into the pocket of her apron, her throat tight. She worked the rest of her shift like a ghost, smiling automatically, refilling cups, nodding at familiar faces, but inside, her thoughts tumbled like sea glass in the tide, sharp, unfinished, impossible to grip. Why now? What did he want? Did he know? When she finally returned home that evening, the apartment felt smaller than usual. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards. The sea green journal sat on her nightstand, untouched since the ultrasound. She stood in front of the mirror, pulled her sweater up just enough to see the gentle curve of her belly rounder now. Unmistakable. Her fingers traced the shape softly, protectively. He doesn't know, she whispered to her reflection. Not yet. And suddenly, the day felt heavier. Because Graham North man of closed doors and deeper silences had come back. And while part of her wanted to slam the door he'd left open, another part, the foolish, tired, tender part, felt a flicker she couldn't name. A memory of soup in a cabin, a fire, a kiss that had meant more than either had dared admit. She climbed into bed fully dressed, the note still in her apron pocket. Sleep didn't come easily. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the windows, wondering if regret could truly rewrite anything. She didn't owe him anything, not her time, not her forgiveness, certainly not the truth, and yet, something in her heart whispered otherwise. The folder wasn't addressed, but inside, it held a truth Graham never expected and couldn't unsee. It arrived in the late afternoon, slid in with a quiet thud by the courier, who didn't wait for a signature. The office, now quieter than it had been in years, felt cold despite the heating. Graham had returned to the Sullivan and North building just a few weeks ago, not to reclaim his old title, but to help with transition documents after the buyout. He hadn't expected anything personal to cross his desk. But the moment he saw the folder unlabeled, plain manila, resting against the edge of his keyboard, something in his chest shifted. He didn't know why at first, only that his fingers hesitated before touching it. He flipped it open. Inside were two items: a grainy black and white ultrasound printout, slightly creased, dated 3 weeks ago, and beneath it, a folded set of prenatal appointment summaries, no letter, no explanation, no name listed in the sender line, just medical facts, dates, and the unmistakable outline of a child yet to be born. The world narrowed to the edges of the page. He stared at the image, the shape of the baby, the curve of a developing spine. A small, printed label in the corner, 12 weeks, 3 days. His breath caught, he did the math, and the cold clarity of realization hit him like a tidal wave. Asheville, the snowstorm, the fire, that night in the cabin. His hand went to his mouth, pressing hard. The room swam. He stood, knocking over his chair in the process. Paperwork fluttered to the floor. The folder remained clutched in his hand, knuckles white. He walked to the window, pressing his palm against the glass like it might steady him. Outside, the Portland streets moved on, calm, unaware. People lived their lives, but his had just cracked open. For years, Graham had lived in control. He managed grief with schedules, love with silence, and vulnerability with work. The loss of his wife had carved out a part of him he never tried to refill. He thought he'd buried that chapter, sealed it off. And yet, here was life. Here was proof that he hadn't just hurt Eleanor Graves. He'd abandoned something more. He picked up his phone with trembling fingers and called the only person who might know anything. "Marla," he said, his voice rougher than usual. His old assistant answered after 2 rings. "Mr. North. Do you know where Eleanor is now?" There was a pause on the line. A subtle inhale. "Then I heard she's working at a cafe down in Boothbay Harbor, by the docks. It's called Dock and Brew. I think, thank you." He hung up before she could ask why. The drive south took nearly 2 hours. Each mile stretched like a confession. The folder sat on the passenger seat, its contents too loud to ignore. Every few minutes, Graham glanced at it, as if the ultrasound might vanish, as if the past could still be unwritten. But it couldn't. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. His mind flickered through memories like shuffled photographs. Ellie at her desk, eyes soft but guarded. Ellie in Asheville, the way her face had looked in the firelight. The way she hadn't asked him for anything, not even that morning when he'd walked out without a word. He hadn't run from her. He'd run from what she made him feel. And now, that cowardice had a heartbeat. Halfway there, he pulled over at a scenic overlook. The sky was low, the water below restless with wind. He cut the engine, the sudden silence hitting like a wave. He sat still for a moment, then leaned forward, forehead against the steering wheel, and cried, not the clean, cathartic kind of cry, but the kind that had waited too long, the kind that came from years of hiding. He cried for the life he'd lost with his wife, for the love he had pushed away in Ellie, for the child growing somewhere along this coast, a child he hadn't known, but who already lived inside him in ways he couldn't explain. He had spent so long trying not to feel, fearing that love only led to loss, that letting someone close would mean breaking again. But now, he wasn't just a man who'd made a mistake. He was a man with a daughter and a second chance. She watched him walk through the cafe door again, but this time, his eyes knew everything. The bell above the door chimed softly, as it always did, but for Ellie, the sound sliced through her like wind off the bay. She was mid-pour, topping off a regular's mug, when she felt the shift in the room, the way the light seemed to gather in one place, the way quiet suddenly had weight. She turned slowly. Graham stood just inside the threshold, shoulders dusted with sea air, hands in the pockets of his coat. He looked the same, and he didn't. Something behind his eyes had broken open and she saw it. Not fear, not pride, but recognition. He knew. There was no question in his gaze, no confusion, just a stillness she had never seen in him before, one that whispered, "I understand now." She didn't look away. She handed off the coffee to the customer beside her and wiped her hands on her apron, steadying herself. Her pulse thudded hard in her wrists, but her face remained calm, composed. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 different ways, but none had prepared her for how soft it would be. How quiet. He walked to table 7 without a word, sat down, waited. Ellie moved slowly, deliberately. She poured a fresh cup of black coffee, no sugar, just as he liked it, and brought it over. Their hands didn't touch when she set it down, but the nearness sparked something deep in her rib cage. They hadn't spoken in months, and still, no words came. Graham met her eyes for only a moment, then looked down at the table, at the mug, at the edges of his own uncertainty. Ellie lingered, just for a breath, then returned to the counter. She didn't need to ask how he found out. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, and that the space between them no longer held secrets, but choices. For the next 20 minutes, neither of them said a word. Customers came and went. Plates clinked, silverware scraped against ceramic. The wind outside pushed softly at the windows, but inside the cafe, time folded in on itself. Graham sipped his coffee slowly. Ellie pretended to wipe an already clean countertop, though her hands trembled just enough for her to feel it in her knuckles. Every few minutes, she glanced over at him and found him watching her. Not the way he had at the office, not like a man assessing a situation or managing a moment, but like someone trying to find the right place to land after being lost at sea. He looked wrecked and open, like the truth had stripped him bare, and he had chosen to stay that way. Ellie felt the pull in her chest, the urge to speak, to explain, to fill the space with something safer than silence. But she didn't. She had carried the weight of this child alone. She had chosen strength over bitterness, grace over revenge, and now she needed to see if he would meet her in that same place, not with words, but with presence. When he stood, she thought he might walk out again. Instead, he reached for the bill, then paused, his fingers resting on the edge of the check. He looked at her, truly looked, and said quietly, "I want to be there, if you'll let me." The words hung between them like breath in cold air, simple, soft, devastatingly honest. Ellie didn't answer, not with words. She held his gaze. Let him see the tears that shimmered but didn't fall. Let him feel the hesitation, the longing, the fear. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. And in that silence, something old between them cracked open and something new waited to begin. He didn't bring roses. He brought peaches. And somehow, that meant more. It was a Tuesday morning when he showed up again, this time not in a suit, not in polished shoes, but in a soft flannel shirt and scuffed boots that carried the smell of salt air and morning soil. The cafe was quiet, the lull between breakfast and lunch, and Ellie was restocking sugar packets near the front when she heard the gentle knock on the side window. She turned, surprised. He didn't come in. He just stood outside the glass with a small, brown paper bag in one hand, and something cautious, almost reverent in his expression. She opened the door halfway. "Hi," he said simply, holding out the bag. She hesitated before taking it. Inside were 4 perfectly ripe peaches. Their skin still carried the fuzz of fresh picking, the color deep gold with blushing red. "I remembered," he added. "You said once, back in Asheville, peaches were your thing." She had. It was a throwaway comment, half laughed over canned soup in a snowstorm. "Pregnancy cravings run in my family. My mom ate nothing but peaches with me." She blinked. The bag felt heavier than its weight. She nodded small, unsure, but didn't close the door. He didn't stay long, just stepped back, gave a faint smile, and said, "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to show up. And then he left. The peaches sat on her kitchen counter all day. She didn't eat them at first, just watched them, touched them gently, like something sacred. They ripened overnight. The next morning, she brought one to work in her bag and took a bite during her break. The juice ran down her hand. It tasted like something she'd forgotten she missed summer. Sweetness, being seen. That weekend, Graham returned not uninvited, not insistent. He sat at table 7, ordered tea this time, and asked if she'd had any more checkups. His voice was softer now, like he was learning the contours of a language he'd never spoken fluently, care. She didn't answer at first, just sat across from him, sipping her cocoa, one hand resting absent-mindedly on the curve of her belly. Then she said, "Next Tuesday." He didn't ask to come. He offered, "If it's okay, I'd like to hear the heartbeat." The words landed gently. No pressure, just hope. Ellie looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. At the clinic. They waited in the small pastel room that smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and lavender. Graham sat with his hands folded, eyes scanning the soft paintings on the walls, baby animals, blooming trees. His knee bounced slightly, nervous, but trying to hide it. Ellie lay on the table, the familiar crinkle of medical paper beneath her. Her gown was open just enough to expose her lower belly. She turned her head toward him and found him watching not her body, but her face. The technician smiled as she applied the cool gel. "You ready to meet the little drummer?" Ellie chuckled quietly. Then the sound came. That fast, steady rhythm like the wings of a hummingbird in flight. Alive, present, undeniable. Graham inhaled sharply, the sound visibly stealing the breath from his chest. Without thinking, his hand reached for hers. Their fingers met slowly, tentatively, but held. His palm was warm, trembling. He didn't speak, just watched the screen, eyes locked on the flickering heartbeat, the tiny profile forming. His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, a silent reverence. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Ellie felt something in him settle like a man finally stepping into the space he'd always been too afraid to claim. Later, in the hallway, he helped her put her coat on. Didn't rush, didn't fumble. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. That night, Ellie sat by the window with her sea green journal open on her lap. Dear little sea star. Today, he came to the appointment. He heard you. I think it changed something in him. Maybe in me, too. He didn't bring flowers. He brought peaches. And he stayed. Love wasn't the only thing that came without warning. So did storms. That morning, the sky was blue clean, open, the kind of sky that made you forget anything bad could happen. Ellie stood barefoot in the kitchen, slicing peaches into oatmeal, the sea breeze coming through the half-open window. Graham had promised he'd come by after stopping at the hardware store. The baby crib was still in pieces in her living room, scattered like small hopes she wasn't ready to put together alone. When she opened the door to him, he held a paper bag full of screws in one hand and a steaming cup of tea in the other, her favorite, chamomile with honey. "Morning," he said quietly. She stepped aside and let him in. They didn't talk about what they were or weren't. There were no labels, no conversations about the past. He didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer guarantees. Instead, he brought tools, groceries, and on rare, brave days a look that said he wanted to be something steady. That day, they worked in quiet rhythm. Graham laid out the pieces of the crib like a puzzle he wanted to get right this time. Ellie sat nearby, reading aloud the instructions and laughing gently when he muttered at the unclear diagrams. "You know," she said, "they say it's good luck if the crib gets built in the rain." He looked up. "Is that real? Or did you just make that up?" She smiled, 50-50. Rain hadn't started yet, but the air had shifted. Outside, the light turned soft, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and the heavy stillness that always came before a storm. They paused for lunch, grilled cheese and tomato soup. the kind of meal that reminded Ellie of childhood, simple, warm, safe. Graham offered to fix the leaky faucet in her bathroom next. She agreed with a nod, then excused herself to take a shower. Her back had been aching, and the warm water usually helped. She lit a candle and hummed to herself softly, one hand on her lower belly. The baby kicked once light, like a tap, and she smiled, even through the exhaustion. But the bathroom tiles were slick, and in one moment of distraction, as she reached for the towel, her foot caught the edge of the bath mat. The world tilted. She fell sideways, landing hard. A cry escaped her lips, sharp, small, afraid. Her elbow scraped the floor. Her hip took the brunt of the fall. Her arms instinctively cradled her belly. Pain, then panic. Graham, she called, voice breaking. She wasn't sure if it was loud enough. The sound of thunder cracked outside just as she tried again. Graham. This time, he heard. He was at the door in seconds, wrenching it open, eyes wide. When he saw her curled on the tile, soaked and trembling, something in him shattered. Ellie, he breathed, rushing to her. What happened? I slipped, she whispered. I don't know if her voice caught. I need to go. Please. Graham didn't waste a second. He wrapped her in the nearest towel, lifted her carefully, cradling her as if she were made of glass. She felt the shake in his arms, even through the strength of them. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest. Wind slammed against the windows. Leaves flew in the air like warnings. He didn't stop to grab his coat. He carried her to the car, set her gently in the seat, fastened the belt himself, and drove. The storm was wild now, rain slashing the windshield, wipers working furiously. He leaned forward, both hands on the wheel, eyes darting between the road and Ellie. She was quiet, breathing slowly, one hand never leaving her stomach. "Stay with me," he said under his breath. "Both of you?" At the hospital, nurses met them at the entrance. Graham carried her inside. A nurse tried to take over with a wheelchair, but he held on a second longer than necessary before finally letting go. Ellie was taken into a room. He was left in a waiting area that felt too bright, too cold. A receptionist handed him a clipboard with forms. "Are you next of kin?" she asked. He hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he hadn't let himself say it aloud. "Yes," he said, voice rough. "I'm the father." She nodded, and he sat down to fill in the blanks. His hands were wet. He wiped them on his jeans before taking the pen. Emergency contact, relationship to patient. "Do you authorize treatment?" "Yes, yes, yes." His name, in his handwriting, on paper. Not just a presence, but a choice. Time passed. The storm outside thundered, echoed in his chest. Finally, a nurse came out. "She's stable. And the baby's okay? You can sit with her soon?" He nodded but couldn't stand yet. Instead, he leaned forward in the waiting chair, elbows on knees, face in hands. He stayed like that a long time. When they let him into the room, Ellie was asleep. The machines hummed softly. Her face was pale but peaceful. Graham sat beside her, looked at the IV, the monitor, then finally at her hand resting over her belly. He didn't reach for it, he just sat there, watched over her, and whispered to the quiet, "I'm not going anywhere." He had signed his name not as a CEO, but as a father. Sometimes love speaks loudest in silence. The storm had passed. The sky over Boothbay Harbor had turned the soft gray of a sweater worn too many times, and the streets still glistened from the rain. Inside the apartment, the air smelled of chamomile, warm bread, and a trace of lemon balm from the candle flickering on the kitchen counter. Ellie sat at the small table, legs tucked beneath her, hands cupped around a mug of tea. Her belly, rounder now, rested gently against the edge of the table. Across from her, Graham stirred sugar into his own tea. Though he didn't drink it, he just stirred and watched it swirl like weather in a cup. Neither of them had spoken in several minutes, but the silence wasn't cold. It felt like waiting for words that mattered. It was their first night home since the fall. Graham had stayed by her side in the hospital, quiet, attentive. He hadn't tried to take control or fix anything. He just showed up with her toothbrush, folded her cardigan over the back of the chair, and held her hand when they brought the baby's heartbeat up on the monitor again. Ellie had said little then, and even now, in the quiet of her own kitchen, with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rain still dripping outside, she didn't quite know where to begin. So he did. I kept thinking, Graham said, his voice low, that if I could just stay useful, maybe I wouldn't have to say the things I didn't know how to say. Ellie glanced up. He looked tired, but not the same kind of tired as weeks ago. There was something looser about his face now, like a man who'd stopped pretending he wasn't afraid. She didn't interrupt. He went on. When I handed you that termination letter, I thought I was doing what was right, not just for the company, but for you. I thought if I created space between us, it would protect you from me. You thought love was the danger, she said softly. He looked at her. After Claire died, he whispered, I told myself I would never put someone in that place again, never allow myself to hold something I couldn't keep. Loving her and losing her nearly wrecked me. I couldn't risk that again. Ellie traced the rim of her mug with her fingertip. But I'm not her. I know, he said immediately. And that's the thing. You weren't replacing anyone. You were something new. And I didn't know how to handle that, so I ran the only way I knew how. She took a slow breath. Do you remember what you said to me that night in the cabin? Graham's gaze softened. Which part? You told me the hardest thing you ever did was come home to an empty house. He nodded. Still is. Ellie looked down. You know what the hardest thing I ever did was? What, walk away from that office with a child growing inside me, and know I couldn't tell you. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't trust you to stay. Her words weren't angry. They were steady, real. Graham's hands stilled. The spoon in his cup finally stopped moving. I'm not perfect, he said. I'm not asking for perfect. Ellie replied, I never was. I just needed someone who wouldn't disappear at the first sign of fear. I was terrified, he admitted. Still am? Good, she said gently. That means you care. They sat with that. Graham reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out something folded, a sonogram image, worn at the edges. He set it on the table between them. I've been carrying this every day, he said. Ellie looked at it, then at him. Not because I needed proof, he continued, but because I needed to remember what's real. He didn't move to touch her hand, didn't reach for her, just looked at her with a kind of quiet resolve. I'm not leaving this time, he said. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. She believed him, not because he said it, but because he'd shown up every day since the fall, because he'd driven through a storm, signed hospital paperwork with shaking hands, folded tiny onesies without being asked. She stood slowly, walked to the sink, and began rinsing her mug. Graham joined her, handed her the towel. They moved side by side, soft, familiar. No grand kiss, no sweeping music, just a normal evening in a kitchen that had seen tears, silence, peaches, and now, the beginnings of something steady. When Ellie went to bed, she didn't close the door, and when Graham followed, quietly, respectfully, she didn't stop him. They didn't talk about tomorrow. They didn't need to. That night, love spoke without needing to be loud. She came in the early hours of September, wrapped in a cry and the smell of autumn. The world was still asleep when Ellie felt the first pull deep inside her body. It wasn't sharp, just a tightening, like a whisper from somewhere beneath her skin. She lay still for a moment in the dark, watching the ceiling as the contraction came and went, faint, measured, but unmistakable. She reached for the clock, 3:47 a.m. By the time the second wave came, she was already sitting at the edge of the bed, one hand resting on the side of her belly, the other reaching for the small overnight bag she'd packed weeks ago. Graham stirred on the couch, as if the air had changed enough to wake him. He blinked, sat up, saw the faint light from under her door, and then he heard her voice. Graham. He was up in an instant, padding down the hallway barefoot. She was already standing, her face calm but pale. "It's time," she said. He didn't panic. He didn't ask if she was sure. He simply nodded, reached for her coat, and slipped her shoes on, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No chaos, no shouting, just the hum of quiet urgency. Outside, the streets were slick with dew. The harbor fog clung to the air, and the stars had already begun to fade as dawn crept behind the hills. He drove carefully, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally brushing hers. Every now and then, she winced, fingers tightening around the armrest. "You're doing great," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. At the hospital, the nurses moved gently. Ellie was admitted quickly. Graham helped her into the gown, held her hair back, rubbed her back when the pain began to deepen. There was no dramatic chaos, no screaming in hallways, just soft lights, the steady beep of monitors, and two people walking through a moment neither of them could fully prepare for. As the hours passed, contractions came faster. Her breath grew shallow. He stayed at her side the whole time, wiping her brow, whispering things she wouldn't remember but needed to hear, that she was strong, that he was here, that she wasn't alone. When she squeezed his hand hard enough to make him wince, he didn't let go. And when the doctor finally said it was time to push, Graham whispered again, "You've got this. I swear." The moment their daughter arrived, the air in the room shifted. 1 second, there was strain and pain and tension. The next, there was the sound of life, a cry so piercing and small, it broke something open in both of them. They placed her on Ellie's chest, warm, damp, pink. Ellie's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, just stayed suspended, like morning mist on a window. Graham didn't speak. He couldn't. He could only watch, heart thundering, hands still trembling from holding hers through the final push. The nurse leaned down, gently asked, "Have you chosen a name?" Ellie nodded, voice barely audible. "June. June Evelyn North." The name settled in the room like something ancient and right. Graham sat down beside Ellie, reaching with hesitant hands. The nurse wrapped June in a soft blanket and placed her gently in his arms. He stared down at the tiny face, the small nose, the impossibly delicate eyelashes. Her fist curled, thumb resting near her cheek. She blinked once, and then closed her eyes, trusting the world to hold her. Graham exhaled slowly. It wasn't awe he felt, not exactly. It was recognition. Like he'd met her before in some quiet dream he never quite remembered until now. Ellie watched him from the bed, her hair damp against her temples, her body worn but glowing with something beyond exhaustion. "She looks like you," she murmured. Graham looked up, startled. "And I hope," she added, voice catching, "that she gets your heart." That undid him, not with tears, but with a stillness deeper than any he'd known. He looked back down at the baby in his arms, so small, so complete, and suddenly, every mistake, every silent room, every sleepless night made a kind of sense. He leaned forward and pressed a kiss to June's forehead, then looked at Ellie, not needing to say anything. Because in that room, love didn't need to be said. It was swaddled in pink and breathing. The millionaire who once fired her now stood in their kitchen burning pancakes and singing lullabies. The smell of something slightly scorched drifted through the small coastal house, mixing with the crisp scent of early autumn. The trees outside had just begun to turn flecks of amber and gold fluttering in the morning breeze. Inside, the world moved slower. Ellie leaned against the doorframe, arms folded gently across her chest, watching. Graham stood at the stove in a t-shirt far too old for someone who once wore tailored suits, flipping pancakes with the kind of care one gave to fragile things, and still somehow managing to get the edges too dark. He was humming something soft under his breath, off-key, barely a melody. June lay just a few feet away, in a cradle Graham had refinished by hand, gurgling at the ceiling, arms waving with delight every time her father's voice rose. She was only 6 weeks old, but already full of personality, fussy at dusk, wide-eyed at sunrise, soothed by the rhythm of the washing machine and the sound of her mother reading poetry out loud. It had become their new normal, a kind of domesticity Ellie never thought she'd know. She had opened her little bookshop just 2 weeks earlier, tucked beside the coffee shop near the harbor. The sign above the door read, Sea Star Books, a quiet nod to the nickname she had once whispered to her belly. It wasn't much, just one room lined with shelves and few chairs near the window, but it was hers. The pace of life had changed. It wasn't slow, exactly, but softer. And Graham had traded conference calls and boardrooms for sleepless nights and diaper changes. He hadn't gone back to his firm, hadn't even pretended to try. He chose this, chose them, and every morning, like clockwork, he tried earnestly and disastrously to make pancakes. Third batch is the charm Ellie teased from across the room. He turned, spatula in hand, mock offense on his face. These, he declared, are only mildly overcooked, not burned. She laughed fully this time. It spilled out like sunlight, and even June cooed in response. Graham walked over with a plate, set it in front of her, and kissed her forehead. They have peaches, he said, because apparently I'm still trying to impress you. You don't need to try, Ellie replied, looking up at him with that same quiet certainty she'd had the night she let him stay. He sat down beside her, close enough for their knees to touch, and for a few moments, they just watched their daughter squirm happily in her cradle. This is better, Graham said softly, than what thon anything I ever thought I wanted. Ellie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Later that day, when June was finally napping and the leaves had started to swirl gently outside the living room window, Ellie sat down with a small leather-bound notebook, the one she'd started when she first learned she was pregnant. The pages were uneven now, some stained with tears, others creased from being read over and over. She turned to the last page and wrote, Dear June, you weren't the start of our story, but you made it worth telling. Before you, there was a girl who thought love meant certainty, who believed the strongest people never broke. Then you came and reminded me that sometimes strength is getting up again when your world has already fallen. You brought your father back to life. You turned silence into music. You taught me that homes aren't built with walls, but with the people willing to stay inside them. Someday you'll ask how we met. You might laugh at how messy it was. You might not believe that your dad once handed me a termination letter instead of a ring, but I hope when you do hear our story, you won't just see what went wrong, you'll see everything we chose to make right, with all the love I never had words for. Mom. She closed the notebook gently, pressing her palm to the cover for a moment. In the kitchen, Graham was cleaning up badly. A stack of pans leaned precariously in the sink, and a trail of flour dusted the countertop. But he was humming again, back turned, lost in the simple rhythm of making a home. Ellie walked over and slid her arms around his waist from behind. He paused. Everything okay? He asked. She nodded into his back. Perfect. And it was. Not because life was flawless, not because they didn't still carry the echoes of past mistakes, but because, somewhere between lost jobs and lost hearts, they had built something neither of them had known how to name before, a home. Sometimes, life doesn't go the way we plan. People walk away, jobs disappear, hearts break in the quietest ways, and yet, somehow, in the middle of what feels like an ending, life whispers, this isn't over. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it's in a paper bag of peaches, a cradle by the window, a letter written to a daughter not yet old enough to read. We are never too old or too broken for a second chance. Love, when real, isn't always loud. It's not polished or scripted. It shows up in the form of staying, of cooking breakfast badly, of being willing to say, I'm still here. If you've ever carried silent pain, if you've ever let someone in and lost them, know this. You are not alone, And it's never too late to start again with a softer heart, a quieter life, and a deeper kind of love. Because home isn't just a place, it's a choice, made and remade, every single day. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, we invite you to help it reach someone else who might need it too. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters. Your support means the world to us and keeps the light of storytelling alive.